I was sitting in my oncologist's office when my phone buzzed with a text from my son David. "Mom, we need to talk about your will. You're dying soon anyway, so let's be practical about this." The words hit me harder than Dr. Martinez's diagnosis had just minutes before. Stage 2 breast cancer, he'd said. Treatable, he'd emphasized. Good prognosis with early intervention. But my own son had already written my obituary. I stared at the phone screen until the words blurred. 72 years old. And this was how my child chose to comfort me after the worst news of my life. Not, "How are you feeling?" or "What did the doctor say?" Just a cold calculation about my death timeline and his inheritance schedule. The second text came before I could even process the first. "Rachel and I have been talking. We should meet this weekend to go over everything. The sooner we get this handled, the better for everyone." Everyone. As if my potential death was a group project that needed efficient management. Dr. Martinez was still talking, explaining treatment options and survival rates. But his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. My hands were shaking as I held the phone, reading those messages over and over. "You're dying soon anyway." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I thought about my late husband, Robert, who'd sat in a similar chair 3 years ago, getting his own cancer diagnosis. I remembered holding his hand, telling him we'd fight it together, that we had so much life left to live. I'd never once calculated how his illness might affect our finances, or rushed him toward end-of-life planning. The idea would have been monstrous. But here was my son, my firstborn, who I'd rocked through countless fevers and nightmares, treating my diagnosis like a business opportunity that needed immediate attention. The third text arrived. As Dr. Martinez handed me a folder of treatment information. "Also, we think you should consider moving somewhere smaller. The house is too much for you now, and honestly, it's not the best use of the asset." Asset. He was calling the home where I'd raised him, where his father had died in my arms, where every room held 40 years of memories, an asset that was being mismanaged. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Martinez's voice cut through my shock. "Do you have any questions about the treatment plan?" I looked up at him. This kind man, who'd just spent 30 minutes explaining how modern medicine could give me many more years of life, and realized he had more faith in my future than my own children did. He was talking about 5-year survival rates and long-term management strategies. My kids were already planning my estate sale. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, sliding the phone into my purse. "Could you repeat the part about the treatment schedule?" But even as Dr. Martinez outlined chemotherapy cycles and surgical options, my mind kept returning to those texts. The clinical detachment, the assumption that I was already 1 foot in the grave, the complete absence of love, concern, or even basic human decency. I'd spent 3 years since Robert's death telling myself that David and Rachel were just busy with their own lives, that their increasing distance was normal adult independence. I'd made excuses for the missed calls, the forgotten birthdays, the holidays they were too swamped to attend. I'd convinced myself that grief affected everyone differently, that they'd come around eventually. Now I understood the truth. They hadn't been grieving their father. They'd been waiting for their inheritance. And my cancer diagnosis wasn't a family crisis requiring support and unity. It was simply the next item on their financial planning checklist. As I walked out of that medical building, treatment folder in one hand and phone full of their heartless messages in the other, I realized that my cancer might not kill me, but my children already had. Robert and I built our life from nothing. When we married 45 years ago, we had a combined savings of $800 and a dream of creating something lasting. Robert worked construction during the day and took real estate courses at night, while I managed a small accounting firm and learned everything I could about property investment. We bought our first rental property when David was 3 and Rachel was still in diapers. A rundown duplex that we spent weekends renovating with the kids playing in sawdust around our feet. Those were the days when David would hand Robert nails and Rachel would help me paint baseboards, getting more paint on herself than the walls. They grew up understanding that wealth wasn't handed down. It was built, board by board, property by property, through decades of sacrifice and smart decisions. By the time Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, we owned 14 rental properties across the city, 2 commercial buildings, and a portfolio of investments worth $4.2 million. More importantly, we'd raised 2 children who we believed understood the value of hard work and family loyalty. I was wrong about the second part. When Robert got sick, I watched my children's true nature emerge like a slow developing photograph. David, my investment banker son, with his perfectly pressed suits and Harvard MBA, suddenly became too swamped with clients to visit more than once a month. Rachel, the corporate lawyer who could argue a case for hours, claimed she was emotionally overwhelmed and needed space to process Dad's illness. But Rosa Valdez never missed a day. Rosa had started working for us 12 years ago, when Robert first began having the stomach issues that would eventually lead to his diagnosis. What began as twice-weekly housekeeping gradually evolved into something deeper. When she noticed Robert's fatigue and quietly began preparing lighter meals, organizing his medications, and creating calm spaces where he could rest between doctor appointments. When the cancer diagnosis came, Rosa didn't ask for a raise or additional responsibilities. She simply showed up every morning at 7 and stayed until I fell asleep each night. She learned to operate the IV pump for Robert's home treatments. She researched anti-nausea recipes and drove to 3 different stores to find the specific ginger tea that helped settle his stomach. She sat beside his bed, reading Tom Clancy novels aloud in her soft accent, because Robert said her voice was soothing. During Robert's final weeks, when he could barely keep his eyes open, Rosa would arrive early to help me change his sheets, and later stay late to help me process the overwhelming emotions of watching the love of my life slip away. She held my hand during his last breath and helped me choose his burial clothes. She organized the funeral reception when I was too shattered to think clearly. David and Rachel attended the funeral. Of course, they looked appropriately grief-stricken and accepted condolences with dignity. But they left immediately after the service, claiming work obligations. Rosa stayed and cleaned my kitchen, while family friends filled my house with casseroles and memories. In my grief, I convinced myself that my children were simply handling loss differently. I made excuses for their absence, telling concerned friends that everyone grieves in their own way and they'll come around when they're ready. I even felt grateful when David suggested adding both kids to my bank accounts and giving them power of attorney for financial decisions, thinking it showed they cared about my well-being. What I didn't realize was that they were positioning themselves for exactly this moment, when I would be vulnerable, scared, and facing my own mortality. They hadn't been grieving their father's death. They'd been preparing for mine. Meanwhile, Rosa continued showing up every day, not because she was paid to care, but because she actually did care. She never mentioned inheritance or financial planning. She brought me soup when I forgot to eat and sat with me during the long, empty evenings when missing Robert felt like drowning. I should have recognized the difference sooner. My 72nd birthday should have been a quiet celebration. I'd made reservations at Bella Vista, the Italian restaurant where Robert and I had celebrated every milestone for 20 years. I invited David, Rachel, their families, and Rosa, because after everything she'd done for our family, she deserved to be included in our special moments. David and Rachel arrived 30 minutes late, without apology or acknowledgement that we'd been waiting. Jessica, David's wife, looked annoyed to be there at all, checking her phone constantly. Brad, Rachel's husband, kept glancing around the restaurant, like he was embarrassed to be seen with us. The grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, seemed uncomfortable and distant. But what hurt most was how they treated Rosa. When she stood to greet them, David gave her a curt nod, like she was the waitstaff. Rachel didn't acknowledge her at all. When I explained that Rosa was joining us for dinner, Rachel's eyebrows shot up in obvious disapproval. "Mom," Rachel said, with barely concealed irritation, "we need to discuss family business tonight. Private family business." I felt Rosa's discomfort beside me and squeezed her hand. "Rosa is family," I said firmly. "She's earned her place at this table more than anyone." That's when the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. David leaned forward with the predatory smile I recognized from his business dealings. "Actually, Mom, that's exactly what we need to talk about. Your judgment lately has been concerning." Before I could respond, Rachel slid a thick manila folder across the white tablecloth. "We've consulted with financial advisors and estate attorneys. You're making decisions that could jeopardize everything Dad worked for." I stared at the folder without opening it. Around us, other diners were enjoying birthday celebrations, anniversary dinners, normal family gatherings. I envied them desperately. "We know about the cancer," David continued, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used with difficult clients. "And we understand you're scared, but you're not thinking clearly anymore. The money you've been spending on unnecessary renovations, the way you've been talking about changing your will, it's not rational." "Rational?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "What's irrational about maintaining my properties or considering my options?" Rachel opened the folder and pointed to documents that had clearly been prepared weeks in advance. "This transfers your real estate holdings into a family trust. David and I will manage everything, so you don't have to worry about these complicated financial decisions anymore." I looked at the papers, pages of legal language designed to strip away my autonomy and transfer my life's work to children who'd barely spoken to me since their father's funeral. "You've been planning this. We've been protecting the family legacy," David said coldly. "Someone has to think about the grandchildren's future. You're dying soon anyway, Mom. We need to be practical about preserving what Dad built." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Dying soon anyway. As if my cancer diagnosis was simply a scheduling convenience for their inheritance timeline. "I'm not signing anything," I said, pushing the folder back across the table. Rachel's mask of concern slipped completely. "We already have power of attorney, Mom. We're trying to do this the easy way, but we can do it the hard way, too. Your cognitive capacity is clearly declining." The restaurant had gone quiet around our table. Other diners were pretending not to watch while obviously listening to every word. The waitstaff had retreated, sensing the toxic atmosphere. Rosa reached for my hand under the table, and David's attention snapped to her like a laser. "This doesn't concern the help," he said, with such venom that several nearby tables turned to stare openly. The help. After 12 years of devotion, of caring for their dying father, of supporting their grieving mother, Rosa was reduced to the help by the son I'd raised, to value human dignity. That word sliced through whatever remaining illusion I had about my children's character. They weren't concerned about my well-being or their father's legacy. They were vultures circling a dying animal, angry that the meal was taking too long. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking with rage rather than age. "This dinner is over. Mom, sit down," Rachel hissed. "You're making a scene." "No," I said, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "You made the scene when you ambushed your cancer-stricken mother on her birthday and called the woman who cared for your dying father the help." I threw my napkin on the table and walked out, Rosa beside me, leaving my children with their legal documents and their shocked expressions. It was the last birthday I would ever share with them. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard David's voice saying, "You're dying soon anyway," with the same casual tone he might use to discuss the weather. I kept replaying Rachel's cold calculation, the way she'd slid those documents across the table like she was serving me my own death warrant. At 3 a.m, I found myself sitting in Robert's old reading chair, surrounded by photo albums I'd pulled from the closet in a desperate attempt to understand where everything had gone wrong. There was 5-year-old David in his Little League uniform, grinning gap-toothed after hitting his first home run. Robert had carried him on his shoulders all the way to the car that day. There was Rachel at her high school graduation, tears in her eyes as she hugged us both, thanking us for believing in her when she wanted to quit debate team. When had those bright, loving children turned into the cold strangers who'd ambushed me at dinner? I found our last family Christmas photo, taken just 2 months before Robert's diagnosis. We were all laughing at something Tyler had said, even Rosa, who joined us that year because she had nowhere else to go. Looking at it now, I could see what I'd missed then. David and Rachel were already pulling away, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes, their body language subtly distant. They'd been waiting, even before Robert got sick. They'd been calculating, planning, positioning themselves for the inevitable payday. Rosa appeared in the doorway at 4 a.m., wearing her robe and carrying 2 cups of chamomile tea. She didn't ask why I was awake or offer empty reassurances. She simply settled into the chair across from me and waited, giving me the gift of quiet companionship. "I keep thinking about when David was 8, I finally said, my voice hoarse from crying. He broke Mrs. Patterson's window playing baseball and was terrified to tell us. When we found out, Robert made him earn the money to replace it by doing extra chores. David was so proud when he handed Mrs. Patterson that $20 bill. He said it felt good to make things right." Rosa nodded, sipping her tea. She'd heard so many of these stories over the years, sitting with Robert during his treatments, listening to him reminisce about better times. When did teaching them responsibility turn into teaching them greed? I asked. We showed them how to work hard, how to build something meaningful, but somewhere along the way, they learned to see dollar signs instead of people. I picked up another photo, Rachel's law school graduation. We'd been so proud, believing we'd raised a daughter who would fight for justice and truth. Instead, she'd learned to use legal language as a weapon against her own mother. "Maybe it's my fault," I whispered. "Maybe we gave them too much, made life too easy. They never had to struggle like Robert and I did." Rosa set down her cup and looked at me with those kind, tired eyes that had seen so much pain in our house. "Mrs. Maggie," she said softly, "I raised 4 children on a housekeeper's salary. 2 of them are teachers now. One's a nurse, and my youngest just graduated college. They all work hard. They all struggle, but they still call me every Sunday just to see how I'm doing." She paused, choosing her words carefully. It's not about the money you had or didn't have. It's about the love. Some people learn to give it, and some people learn to take it. Your children learn to take. The truth of her words hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent 3 years making excuses for David and Rachel's behavior, telling myself they were grieving, they were busy, they were processing loss in their own way. But the reality was simpler and more devastating. They'd learned to see relationships as transactions, and I was simply an asset to be managed until liquidation. Robert used to say that character isn't what you do when people are watching, I said, remembering one of his favorite phrases. It's what you do when you think no one will ever find out. Rosa nodded. And now you know their character. I looked around at the photos scattered across my lap. Birthdays, holidays, graduations, family vacations, all those years of believing I was raising good people. And instead, I'd somehow created beautiful monsters who would calculate my worth in dollars while I was literally fighting for my life. But sitting there with Rosa, I realized something else. Real family, the kind that matters, doesn't abandon you when things get difficult. It doesn't measure your value in inheritance potential. It shows up at 4 a.m. with tea and sits quietly while you grieve the loss of people who are still alive. The children I'd raised were gone, if they'd ever really existed at all. But the woman sitting across from me, offering comfort without expecting anything in return, was proof that love still existed in my world. I just had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The next morning, I called Patricia Wells, the attorney who'd handled our family's legal matters for over 20 years. Patricia had been Robert's law school classmate and had watched our children grow up. If anyone would understand the devastating betrayal I'd experienced, it would be her. Maggie. Patricia's voice was warm, but concerned when I explained what had happened at dinner. I need you to come in immediately. There are things about your financial situation that David and Rachel don't know. Things Robert specifically kept private. An hour later, I sat in Patricia's oak-paneled office while she pulled out a file marked Chen Family, Confidential. Her expression was grim as she opened it. First, the power of attorney documents your children have are limited and conditional, she began. They can only act on your behalf if you're medically incapacitated, and even then, only for routine financial maintenance. They cannot make major asset transfers or changes to your estate planning. Relief flooded through me, but Patricia wasn't finished. More importantly, Robert set up something 3 years ago that only you and I knew about. He called it his nuclear option. She pulled out a thick document. It's a separate, irrevocable trust worth $1.8 million, completely outside your main estate. You have absolute discretion over its distribution. I stared at the papers. Robert's familiar signature at the bottom. Why didn't he tell me about this? Patricia's expression darkened. Because David and Rachel were already pressuring him to change his will before he died. They visited this office 4 times without your knowledge, trying to convince him to restructure everything to minimize estate taxes, which would have coincidentally given them immediate access to significant assets. My hands trembled as the full picture emerged. They were planning this, even while he was dying. Robert was furious, Patricia continued. He told me, if my children are already planning my funeral before I'm dead, I need to protect Maggie from them. That's when he created this trust and added specific provisions to prevent them from manipulating you during your grief. She handed me an envelope with my name, written in Robert's careful handwriting. He left this for you, with instructions to give it to you only if his concerns about the children proved justified. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. My dearest Maggie, if Patricia is giving you this letter, it means our children have shown their true colors. I saw the calculation in their eyes during my illness, the way they asked about property values and investment accounts while I was struggling to breathe. I realized they weren't mourning my life. They were auditing it. You always see the best in people, especially our children. But I've watched David become ruthless in his business dealings, and Rachel grow cold in her pursuit of partnership. They learn to value success over character, and I fear they see you as an obstacle to their inheritance rather than their mother. Take care of Rosa. She's shown more genuine love for our family in 12 years than our children have in 40+ years of life. She deserves security and comfort. She's more family than they ever were. I love you, Maggie. Choose happiness over obligation. Choose people who choose you. Forever yours, Robert. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling Robert's presence in the room. He'd known, even while fighting cancer, battling pain, facing his own mortality. He'd seen what I'd been too heartbroken to acknowledge. Patricia leaned forward. Maggie, that trust gives you complete freedom. You can distribute those assets to anyone you choose. Rosa, charities, strangers on the street. Your children have no legal claim to it whatsoever. For the first time since that horrible birthday dinner, I smiled. Robert had given me something more valuable than money. He'd given me the power to choose love over blood, character over genetics. My children thought they held all the cards. They had no idea their father had been playing a different game entirely. I spent the next 2 weeks becoming someone I'd never been before, calculating, strategic, and completely deceptive. While David and Rachel believed they had me cornered, I was quietly gathering intelligence on their true motivations with the precision of a military operation. The first revelation came from Jessica, David's wife, during what she thought was a casual coffee meeting. I'd invited her to lunch under the pretense of wanting to understand David's concerns better. Within 20 minutes, she was bragging about their plans for David's inheritance properties. We've already talked to contractors about flipping the rental units, Jessica said, obliviously stabbing her salad. David thinks we can increase their value by 30% with modern renovations. Plus, the commercial buildings will provide amazing passive income for the kids' college funds. I nodded sympathetically, while internally noting that they'd been planning the dismantling of my life's work in precise detail. They hadn't just decided I was dying soon. They'd created a business plan around it. The second piece of evidence came from my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who mentioned seeing Rachel at the house across the street that had recently She was measuring rooms and talking to that handsome husband of hers about square footage. Mrs. Patterson said innocently, "Such a lovely young woman, planning ahead for when she inherits your beautiful home." That evening, I called Patricia and shared what I'd discovered. Together, we crafted a plan that would have made Robert proud of its elegant simplicity. "We'll use their own greed against them," Patricia explained as we outlined the strategy. "Let them think they're winning, while we systematically dismantle their assumptions." The first step was financial reconnaissance. I discovered that David had already been telling his investment clients about significant new assets under management coming in the next year. He'd calculated my life expectancy based on cancer statistics and built it into his business projections. Rachel, meanwhile, had researched assisted living facilities and told her partner that she'd have substantial equity available for the firm's expansion. Within 18 months, working with Patricia, I quietly transferred the majority of my liquid assets into new accounts at a different bank. We changed all passwords and security questions, revoked their limited power of attorney, and created ironclad documentation for every decision. Patricia's team worked with surgical precision, ensuring every move was legally bulletproof. The centerpiece of our plan was the trust Robert had created. We would transfer not just the $1.8 million he'd set aside, but an additional $600,000 from my personal accounts, plus 2 of the rental properties. Rosa would receive $2.4 million in total, enough to secure her future and honor the woman who'd shown our family genuine love. "What about David and Rachel?" Patricia asked. I smiled, with a coldness that surprised even me. "They'll receive exactly what they deserve. The legal minimum required by law, and a detailed explanation of why." For 2 weeks, I played the role of confused, frightened elderly woman, asking them to explain things more slowly and requesting time to think everything over. They grew increasingly impatient, but confident, believing my hesitation was fear rather than strategy. David even had the audacity to suggest I was getting more confused by the day and that they needed to act quickly before Mom's condition deteriorates further. They had no idea that every conversation was being carefully documented, every manipulation recorded, every cruel assumption noted for the moment when I would present them with the consequences of their heartless calculations. The trap was set. Now, I just had to spring it. I called David and Rachel on a Tuesday morning, my voice perfectly calibrated to sound defeated and resigned. "I've been thinking about what you said at dinner. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not thinking clearly anymore." The lie tasted bitter, but their immediate relief was audible through the phone. "We can meet this Saturday at the house," I continued. "I'm ready to discuss your proposal seriously." David's voice practically purred with satisfaction. "That's great, Mom. You're making the smart choice. Rachel and I will bring everything you need to sign." They arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, armed with folders, notarized documents, and smug confidence. David carried a leather briefcase, like he was closing a major business deal. Rachel wore her courtroom suit, projecting authority and control. They'd even brought Jessica and Brad as witnesses, clearly planning to make this transfer as legally binding as possible. I served coffee in the living room where I'd raised them, where Robert had taught them to play chess, where we'd celebrated countless Christmas mornings. The irony wasn't lost on me, that they were about to destroy those memories for money. "We've streamlined everything," Rachel announced, spreading papers across the coffee table with practiced efficiency. 3 signatures, and this whole mess gets resolved. You won't have to worry about any of these complicated financial decisions anymore." I looked at their documents, pages designed to strip away my autonomy and transfer my life's work to children who saw me as an inconvenient obstacle to their inheritance. Then I reached into my own folder and pulled out Patricia's carefully prepared paperwork. "Before we discuss your proposal," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I need to tell you about some decisions I've already made." David's eyes narrowed. "What kind of decisions?" "Rosa, could you come in here, please?" I called towards the kitchen. Rosa appeared, looking nervous but dignified. I'd explained the plan to her the night before, and she'd wept with gratitude and disbelief. She'd tried to refuse, saying it was too much, that she didn't deserve such generosity. I'd held her hands and told her that love recognizes love, and she'd earned every penny through 12 years of genuine care. "Rosa," I said, gesturing for her to sit beside me, "I want you to hear this too, since it concerns you directly." I slid my own documents across the coffee table. I've made my decision about asset distribution. Rosa, you are now the beneficiary of $2.4 million, including 2 rental properties and various investment accounts. The transfer is effective immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, pure rage. Rachel's mouth fell open, her legal mind clearly racing through implications and challenges. "You can't be serious," David finally managed, his voice strangled. "I'm completely serious," I replied calmly. "Patricia Wells has handled all the documentation. Everything is legal, notarized, and irrevocable." As if summoned by her name, Patricia walked through the front door with a second set of documents. I'd given her a key months ago, and her perfectly timed arrival was the final theatrical touch. "Good afternoon, everyone," Patricia said with professional cheerfulness. "I have the finalized transfer documents and bank confirmations. Everything has been processed as Mrs. Chen requested." David exploded out of his chair. "You can't give our inheritance to the maid. This is insane. You're not competent to make these decisions." "I'm not a maid," Rosa said quietly, her dignity intact despite the attack. "I'm family." Rachel's lawyer instincts kicked in immediately. "We'll challenge this. We'll have you declared mentally incompetent. This is clearly the result of diminished capacity and undue influence." I smiled at my daughter with genuine pity. "Feel free to try. I've undergone complete psychological evaluation. Dr. Martinez has confirmed that my cancer treatment hasn't affected my cognitive abilities in any way. Patricia has documentation proving I made these decisions independently, without coercion or influence." Patricia opened her briefcase and handed Rachel a thick envelope. "These are copies of all relevant medical and legal documentation. You'll find everything is completely legitimate and legally bulletproof." The room erupted in accusations, threats, and desperate bargaining, but I sat calmly in the eye of the storm, finally at peace with my decision. I'd chosen love over obligation, character over genetics, and generosity over greed. My children had calculated my death. Instead, they'd witnessed their own moral bankruptcy. The war began immediately. David and Rachel launched a coordinated assault that revealed the depths of their desperation and the lengths they'd go to reclaim what they'd never actually owned. Within 48 hours, Rachel had filed emergency paperwork claiming I suffered from dementia and requesting immediate guardianship. She submitted a petition declaring me mentally incompetent, citing erratic financial decisions and susceptibility to manipulation by household staff. Her legal filing painted Rosa as a predatory caregiver who'd exploited a vulnerable elderly woman, a narrative so twisted it made me nauseous. David took a different approach, calling my bank and credit card companies, claiming I was the victim of elder abuse. He'd convinced himself that his limited power of attorney gave him authority to freeze my accounts. When that backfired, since I'd already moved my money and revoked his access, he showed up at my new condo with a geriatric care specialist he'd hired to evaluate my mental state. The woman, Dr. Helena Voss, arrived with official-looking credentials and a clipboard full of cognitive assessments. She spent 20 minutes asking me basic questions about dates, names, and simple math before David realized I was passing every test with perfect scores. Dr. Voss quietly packed up her materials and left, later sending a report that confirmed my complete mental competency. But their most vicious attack came through the grandchildren. Emma, David's 16-year-old daughter, called me sobbing hysterically about how I'd destroyed the family and didn't love them anymore. Through her tears, She begged me to reconsider, saying her father had promised her a car and college tuition from her inheritance. "Grandma, please," she wept into the phone. "Dad says we might lose our house because you gave all our money away. Tyler's crying every night. How could you do this to us?" My heart shattered listening to her pain. But something in her phrasing felt rehearsed when I gently asked her to explain exactly what her father had told her. The truth emerged like poison from a wound. David had coached both grandchildren on what to say. He'd promised Emma a BMW for her 17th birthday if she could guilt me into reversing the transfers. He'd told Tyler that Grandpa's money was his college fund. And now his educational future was ruined because I'd given it to a stranger. The manipulation was so calculated, so cruel, that it took my breath away. David was using his own children as emotional weapons, teaching them to see love as a transaction and family relationships as negotiable contracts. Rachel's approach was more direct. She arrived at my condo at 7 a.m. on a Thursday, her face hard with lawyer determination. "This ends now, Mother. I've researched Rosa's immigration status, her tax filings, everything. One word from me, and she'll face federal investigation for tax evasion and fraud." "Rosa has done nothing wrong," I replied, not inviting Rachel inside. "Maybe not," Rachel said with a cold smile. "But the investigation process would destroy her life, drain her resources, and potentially result in deportation. Is your little gesture of defiance worth destroying her future?" It was blackmail, pure and simple. My own daughter was threatening to ruin an innocent woman's life to reclaim money she'd never earned. The woman who'd cared for her dying father, who'd comforted her grieving mother, who'd shown our family nothing but loyalty and love. Rachel was prepared to destroy Rosa for the crime of being chosen over blood relatives. "Do whatever you think you need to do," I told her, "but understand that every threat you make, every cruel manipulation you attempt, every innocent person you try to hurt, proves exactly why I made the right decision." Rachel's mask slipped completely. "You're a bitter, vindictive old woman who's punishing her children for not grieving the way you wanted us to. Dad would be ashamed of what you've become. Your father," I said quietly, "is the one who set up the trust that made this possible. He saw your true nature before I did, and he gave me the tools to protect myself from it." For the first time since this nightmare began, Rachel looked genuinely shaken. The idea that her beloved father had orchestrated her financial exile was clearly a blow she hadn't anticipated. The guardianship hearing became their final, desperate gambit and their ultimate humiliation. The judge reviewed medical evaluations, psychological assessments, and financial records. Patricia presented evidence of David and Rachel's premature inheritance planning, their calculated manipulation, and their attempts at elder abuse through intimidation. When the judge asked why my children believed I was incompetent, their lawyer could only point to my decision to give money to my housekeeper rather than my blood relatives. The judge's response was swift and scathing. Adult children have no inherent right to their parents' assets. Mrs. Chen's decision to reward loyalty over genetics shows wisdom, not dementia. The case was dismissed. Their legal threats evaporated. Their manipulation tactics had failed. They were left with nothing but the knowledge that their greed had cost them everything, not just money, but any hope of genuine reconciliation with the mother they'd betrayed. 6 months later, I wake up each morning in my bright, airy condo overlooking the lake, and I don't feel like I'm dying anymore. My oncologist, Dr. Martinez, smiles more during our appointments now. The chemotherapy is working better than anyone expected, and my latest scans show the cancer retreating. Your mental state affects your physical healing more than people realize, he told me last week. Whatever you changed in your life, keep doing it. What I changed was simple. I stopped living for people who saw me as a burden and started living for people who see me as a gift. Rosa used her inheritance to buy a charming house 3 blocks from mine, with a garden where she grows the vegetables her grandmother taught her to cultivate in Mexico. She started a small catering business called Corazon Kitchen, Heart Kitchen, serving authentic Mexican food to the community. She still works for me twice a week, but now it's friendship, not employment. We cook together, laugh together, and share stories about our grandchildren. Her grandchildren call me Abuela Maggie and visit every Sunday for homemade tamales and board games. 8-year-old Sophia brings me drawings from school, and 12-year-old Carlos teaches me Spanish phrases that make Rosa giggle. They fill my home with the sound of children's laughter. Something I'd forgotten I missed. I've discovered passions I never had time for during my property building years. My art studio overlooks the lake, and I paint sunrise after sunrise, never a sunset. Rosa jokes that I'm documenting hope, not endings. Maybe she's right. I joined a book club where retired women discuss novels with the intensity we once reserved for raising children. I volunteer at the Literacy Center, teaching adults to read, remembering why education matters more than inheritance. David and Rachel made one final attempt at reconciliation 3 months ago, arriving with carefully rehearsed apologies after learning my cancer was responding well to treatment. But their contrition was conditional. Rachel suggested we revisit the financial arrangements now that your health is improving. And David mentioned that Rosa probably doesn't need that much money anyway. I declined their reconciliation as politely as I would decline spoiled food. Emma, my granddaughter, reaches out secretly through text messages. She'll be 18 soon and starting college with the fund I've established for her education. Money her parents know nothing about. She writes things like, "I understand now, Grandma. Love isn't supposed to have conditions." She gives me hope that goodness can survive even the worst family patterns. The final scene of my new life happens every evening at sunset. Rosa and I sit on my balcony with cups of her grandmother's hot chocolate recipe, watching the sun paint the lake in colors that change every night. Sometimes we talk about our day. Sometimes we plan weekend adventures. Sometimes we sit in comfortable silence. Last week, Rosa found me looking at a framed photo of Robert on my easel. "Do you think he'd be proud of what I did?" I asked. She smiled with that gentle wisdom that had sustained me through my darkest moments. "Mrs. Maggie, you chose happiness, just like he told you to. You chose people who choose you back. That's not just what he wanted. That's what love is supposed to be." I didn't just survive my children's betrayal. I discovered that the people who show up when everything falls apart aren't just helping you heal. They're showing you what family was always meant to be. Blood may be thicker than water, but love is thicker than blood. And sometimes, the best inheritance you can leave is the example of choosing love over obligation, generosity over greed, and new beginnings over bitter endings. At 72, with cancer in my body, but peace in my heart, I'm not dying anymore. I'm finally living.